While I personally believe that great stories are truly timeless, the publishing industry is influenced by trends to some degree. That's because the major publishing houses want to ultimately feed whatever readers are craving so that they make more book sales and are able to meet that demand. Think of it like Netflix trying to put out more and more bingeable shows. Publishing houses are trying to do the same thing and capture readers' attention while giving them a story that they really fall into and love. So I want to talk a little bit today about some potential publishing trends for 2022. I know it's a topic a lot of you are interested in, and it's one that I was curious to research as well heading into the new year. If you spend any time at all on Twitter or on Book Talk, then you'll likely see agents and editors at publishing houses talking about what they're looking to see more of in the new year. So it can be really interesting to see what everyone's kind of talking about and how your project that you might be working on might potentially fit into some of these publishing trends. So for this video, I did some primary research and a little bit of investigation on Twitter using the advanced search feature. I looked at different genre keywords and typed in the hashtag MSWL, which stands for manuscript wishlist, which is the hashtag that agents and editors at publishing houses use whenever they are trying to call out the types of stories that they want to see come through their inbox. So if you haven't checked it out, I recommend doing so. It's really, really interesting. So I ran multiple searches, scoured through all of these tweets that agents and editors were sending out in the first 2 weeks of January, and compiled a few trends that I saw, and I'm going to share them with you today. Now, this research project I did is not definitive by any stretch of the imagination. It really is more anecdotal, just what I was seeing online. So do not take this as gospel by any means, but I hope it is interesting and insightful for you. Another disclaimer I want to make before I dive in is that I absolutely do not recommend changing or, God forbid, trashing your project if it doesn't fall into one of the genres or categories that I'm going to talk about today. That is not what this is about at all. The truth is that even if these are things that agents and editors are saying they want to see in their inbox, that absolutely does not mean that is the only thing they're going to represent, the only thing they're going to acquire, or the only thing that is going to get published. That is not the case at all. A great story is a great story, and they are going to recognize that whether or not it falls into one of these genre trends. So take all of this with a grain of salt. I really want this video to be informational and educational, but I absolutely am not intending for you to change your project in any way. If you're working on a book or you're interested in reading or the publishing industry at all, I recommend subscribing to my channel. Every week I post a new video either talking about the industry like this video or giving writing tips, especially for people working on novels. So let's dive into the first genre trend that I saw, which is horror. Now, admittedly, this one really surprised me because when I was working in the publishing industry, horror was really a genre that I perceived as being published in more niche circles. So the imprint that I worked at, which was Ballantine Books at Random House, really didn't cover a ton of horror. It was more the specialized sci-fi fantasy imprints that would cover some horror. But it was really interesting to see on Twitter that it seems to be surfacing and a lot of agents are requesting horror manuscripts. Why could that be? I wonder if the popularity of Squid Game perhaps has something to do with it. Of course, that was a blockbuster horror type hit that, really fed a type of appetite that clearly people have right now. Also, I wonder if with the pandemic, we're all in this strange headspace and kind of want to lean into those darker themes, which horror obviously delivers. Something that I noticed when I saw agents and editors talking about horror is that they are using phrases like literary horror or atmospheric horror, which I interpret to mean that the story is not totally reliant on the gory or violent elements. There is likely also a strong plot and strong character development as well as setting development as well. Perhaps this means that they're looking for horror manuscripts that could appeal to people who don't necessarily consider themselves horror readers. Maybe it is blending with that suspense trend that we see, and readers that maybe wouldn't necessarily pick up a horror novel would be intrigued by it because it has elements of these other literary genre as well as suspense genre within it. Of course, that's just my interpretation. I am not an active agent or editor at a publishing house right now, but I am just giving you my interpretation of what I'm seeing online. The second trend that I saw was rom-coms. This is pretty much the polar opposite of horror. So why are agents and editors requesting both of these vastly different genres? I don't know. And granted, it's not necessarily the same agents and editors that are requesting both, but it's really interesting that both of these are surfacing in tandem with each other. Specifically, I saw that publishing professionals were looking for YA and adult rom-coms. Some of them even mentioned the Netflix movie To All the Boys I've Loved Before, which was a really big hit and I think has 2 or 3 more movies out now, and that really does illustrate the YA vein. I can't help but wonder if the interest in rom-coms is kind of operating as an antidote to the interest in darker fiction that we're clearly seeing with the rise of the horror genre. It could be that people want something lighthearted and fun to kind of counterbalance all the stress and angst and anguish that we are feeling during these pandemic times. Again, that's just my theory. The third trend that I saw was diverse characters. Now, this is speaking to a broader movement within the publishing industry, which in the past years has really been trying to actively address its diversity issue and make sure that they are rebalancing not only the authors that they publish, but also the types of books that they publish, as well as the types of people that work at the publishing house. So with that, many agents and editors are really interested in seeing stories that feature more characters of color, specifically BIPOC characters, as well as characters with disabilities or LGBTQIA+ characters. They're interested in stories that not only bring those characters into the mainstream, but also highlight and celebrate their unique experiences and worldviews. Something that I saw specifically in the Twitter MSWL hashtag was agents and editors looking for diverse characters within specific genres. For instance, they were looking for romance that featured diverse characters, or thrillers / suspense that featured diverse characters, or historical fiction that featured diverse characters. An example of one of these could be the hit from a couple years ago, Red, White, and Royal Blue, which was a gay romance novel that really took off. The fourth trend that I saw during my Twitter research was thrillers. Now, this is a perpetually popular genre that just continues to hit the bestseller list and continues to be made into films and continues to permeate our culture. It's actually one of the genres that I mention in my video on the best book genres because it is one that I saw all the time whenever I was working in the industry, something that it feels like a ton of agents and editors are looking for. In my Twitter search for 2022, I saw that publishing professionals were looking for both YA thrillers and adult thrillers. Now, the tricky part here is that they are really looking for stories that have a fresh and unique twist. Because the thriller genre has been really saturated in recent years, and even though it continues to be popular, you want to make sure that your story is bringing something new to the table and that it isn't predictable or falling into the same tropes that readers have already seen. If you are writing a thriller, I recommend checking out my video on overdone plot twists. That could be really helpful to see how you might be able to spin a plot twist in a new way and ensure you are not falling into these overused twists that agents and editors might be tired of seeing. Not to mention that readers might be tired of reading. Something else that was really interesting was I saw a number of agents and editors mentioning the Yellow Jackets series, which is something I haven't watched before, but I've now put it on my list. So they're looking for fiction that's in line with that show, which I understand is psychological suspense with maybe a little bit of horror. And the last trend that I noticed was agents and editors looking for fantasy. Now, most publishing professionals that I saw on Twitter that were mentioning fantasy were looking for either middle grade or young adult fantasy, but there was a few also mentioning adult fantasy. A number of them were also looking for stories that combined romance and fantasy, so a kind of hybrid romantic fantasy genre. They were also looking for fantasy narratives that weren't necessarily rooted in a Western culture or tradition. If you are working on a fantasy novel, I recommend being careful with who you send out your queries to, because something else that I saw when I was going through the Twitter search was fantasy was either at the top of an agent's manuscript wish list, or the agent was specifically calling out, do not query me with fantasy novels. So it's really important that you find agents who do specialize in fantasy and who are looking for it. Otherwise, you might be an automatic rejection. So as I said in the intro, if you are not working on a novel that falls into one of these trending categories, do not feel bad at all. It does not mean game over, and it does not mean that you won't get published. On this channel, I really just want to bring you as much insight and information as I can so that you can be as informed as possible whenever you are working on your book and going into the publishing journey. Plus, I just find it interesting and wanted to share some of these little insights with you as well. Let me know in the comments what you are working on this year, what your book is about, and what your goals are for 2022. If you are getting ready to reach out to literary agents, I recommend checking out my video on how to get a literary agent. There's some tips there that will help you stand out as you are querying. And as always, if you found this video interesting or helpful, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. I'm so excited to continue growing this community, and I'm so grateful for all of you. Thanks so much for watching, and happy writing.